Hey folks, welcome to Dictors 101. This is a video version of a very hands-on class that we run as part of the Caretaker and NBI program in Pandemic Horde. So if you do see the Dictor Flight School pinged in Discord or on the schedule in Horde Squared, then try and take advantage of that and join it. If that never seems to line up though, then this video serves as an alternative which you can watch and try out some of the maneuvers on your own. So for those of you who are unaware, Dictors, or Interdictors, are a T2 destroyer class hull, one for each race, and what they can do is drop interdiction spheres in space, called bubbles. So these bubbles last 2 minutes, have a radius of 20 kilometers, and the main thing they do is they stop people from being able to warp. So if I try and warp over to this bookmark here, which I usually would be able to, I get a warning that I'm unable to because I'm in a warp disrupt probe area. So as you can imagine, dropping these bubbles is going to be absolutely critical for deciding when fights happen, where they happen, who gets involved in them. Dropping a good bubble can trap the enemy fleet and result in awesome kills. Dropping a bad bubble can trap your own fleet and result in them getting killed, or the enemy getting away because you bubble your own fleet and then they can't warp after the enemy. In addition to stopping people from warping out of them, bubbles also prevent people from warping through them under certain conditions we'll go over in more detail in a second. So here, if I try to warp to my bookmark at 0, that's 300 kilometers away, but there's a bubble on top of it, you'll see I don't go all the way into it. I get stopped at the edge of the bubble. So this is useful if you imagine this being a gate or a wormhole and you're trying to stop the enemy from being able to escape easily. Then they get stuck in the bubble and they have to burn into the gate. And you can put these off of objects as well and get people stuck even farther from the gates, called stop bubbles or sling/drag bubbles, which I'll show you in just a moment. So because of how important dictors are in deciding where fights happen and when and all of that good stuff, they're needed on basically every fleet, at least all fleets in nullsec, wormhole space, and Pochven. You can't drop bubbles in Empire space, so low sec or high sec. And the people who are flying dictors have a lot more responsibility than most people, because as I just mentioned, one bad bubble and you can let the enemy fleet escape or get your own fleet killed. You're also usually doing your own thing to an extent. You might be over sitting on a gate, waiting to bubble it or keeping it bubbled. When the FC says anchor up, you're rarely going to be anchoring up. You're going to be flying in and trying to bubble the enemy fleet or apply scrams in some situations. You'll be warping in and out more. You might be cloaking up and hiding with the enemy fleet on grid. There's just a lot more independence and a lot more critical thinking skills required, and experience too, I guess, which only comes with time, so you have to get out there and try it yourself. Before we get too much more into the details of how bubbles work though, let's actually take a look at the different dictor ships. So there are a couple different ways you can fit a dictor. For example, you could have a combat probing heretic that probes ships down, warps onto them, and bubbles them. You could have a solo flycatcher that you go out and roam in that's focused purely on control. You can have an heiress that you're flying solo or in a small gang, or a gate camp where you're trying to use massive blaster DPS to kill things quickly. What we're going to focus on today though is fleet fits, right? So flying a dictor in support of a gang or a fleet or something along those lines. And for those fits, you basically need the following things fitted. You need your bubble launcher for actually dropping your probes, or not your probes, your warp disrupt probes. I guess they're still called probes. But your bubbles. You need an MWD for mobility and crashing gate. You need a cloak. This is going to be really useful because when you bubble, you yourself are also trapped in your bubble. So there's times you're going to need to escape, and a cloak can help you with that. It also helps you crash gate. Launching a bubble does not cause aggression, as we'll see later. So that means that if you bubble a gate, you can always jump, and sometimes you want your cloak to get back to gate. You do want to scram. This is going to be for defensively scramming. If you're on grid and you get tackled or something comes close that could tackle you, you can scram it to get it away. You'll also sometimes in a dictor be acting as light tackle. So usually you're going to not be engaging on things. You're going to be focusing on staying alive and bubbling. But depending on the type of fleet, the situation, you might also go in and scram things and apply your DPS. So you want a scram fitted, and then hyperspatial rigs. This Saber fit, sort of the standard, has 2. Some other fits will only have 1 on the Eris, for example. The hyperspatials increase your warp speed, and this lets you warp basically, in this Saber you warp faster than a regular interceptor, so it allows you to get ahead of the fleet and chase things down or get to gates quickly, just in time to drop bubbles at the opportune moment. And it definitely can come down to seconds, where you land on a gate and get in position just in time as the enemy fleet's jumping in, and then you can bubble them. So there's an interdictor for each of the 4 races. A long time ago, the Saber was basically the only good one. So you'll still hear FCs mention, I need Sabers, or Sabers do this, when what they actually mean is, I need Interdictor. Because nowadays, all 4 of them are perfectly valid. The Saber is still probably the best general one for most people. The Saber and Eris being the 2 fast ones. The Saber is nice because it has a nice big shield buffer, so that you can catch reps from shield-repped ships, and if you're flying with shield logi in your fleet. And it also is a buffer so that you can take a bunch of hits while you're trying to crash gate or get off without having to worry about getting alphaed off as much. The Eris, though, is actually a little bit better than the Saber in practically every way. It's a little bit faster, aligns better, does a bit more DPS, has a bit more options for DPS. It's just slightly better. The only problem is it's armor tanked with plates. That's its hull bonus. So if you're flying the Eris, you have to find a way to heal up, right? The Saber's shields are going to heal automatically, like the shield regens. Eris's armor is not. So you either have to be in armor rep fleet or be around places that you can stop and rep up, like NPC stations or citadels, etc. Or possibly fit it with local rep, which is something I do, but it's not very common. And then the Flycatcher and Heretic are both the really tanky, slow guys. So the Flycatcher is a favorite because it can just like chill on grid with 30,000 effective hit points, bubbling the enemy fleet, and staying alive thanks to reps, or being able to crash gate with a ton of EHP that the enemy will have to burn through before they can kill you. And it also has a lot of mids for a lot of variation if you want to fit dual prop or other stuff, and good damage application as well. So it's one of the most common solo ones. And then the Heretic, same as the Flycatcher except for armor. So if you were flying in Retribution and Deacon fleet, they might ask you to bring a Heretic. And it also has a lot of CPU, so you can fit expanded probe launchers for combat probes. I'm not going to go over this too much. This slide is actually from my big brain bubble, Dictors 102, 201. I don't know. There's no official class rank system, but I talk a lot about it a bit more here. There. The point here, though, is as long as you have your bubble launcher, your MWD, cloak, scram, and probably hyperspatials, depending on your exact role in the fleet, you'll be all set, and all the Dictors, when it comes to race, are just fine. Alright, so back in space now. You'll recall from before that in addition to not being able to warp out of a bubble, if you try and warp into a bubble, you get caught on the edge of it, right? So I have some bookmarks set up here. This one 500 kilometers away, and this one 1,000 kilometers away. So naturally I can warp to either of these, since they're both greater than 150 kilometers, which is the minimum warp distance. Let's say I warp to this one at 100 kilometers. If I drop a bubble when I land, it's going to be 100 kilometers off of this bookmark and in line with where I just warped from, right? So the bubble's up, and I'll head back to my initial starting position. You can see that when I'm in warp from this bookmark to this bookmark, it's going to be passing through this bubble. And I imagine you're going to be able to guess what's going to happen here if you don't already know. This is called a stop bubble. There's an extra hint. And it's going to stop me, right? I'm not going to be able to warp all the way to this bookmark like I want to. Because my path is intersecting the bubble, I'm going to get stopped by it. Now note that if my path is not intersecting the bubble, such as from this ping over here, then it's not going to stop me. So if you have a bubble right on, let's say this was a gate, that's great because no matter where people warp from, they're not going to be able to get to the gate at 0. If you have a bubble that's like a stop bubble like this, it's handy because it keeps them further off of the gate, so they have to take more time to get there. However, from other angles, if they warp off to a ping or something, then they can bypass the bubble. Oh, oh no, I didn't get caught in the edge. Just barely squeezed past the bubble, and I got directly to the bookmark like I wanted to, right? So these sort of stop bubbles are used fairly often in fleets. One purpose is as a trap. If you're out roaming, you might have your entire fleet look like they're warping to a gate, but actually warp to a ping off the gate, or sorry, to inline distance to the gate and drop a bubble, and then catch whoever's warping who thinks they'll be safe because they can just jump gate if they get attacked. And it's also used defensively when your fleet's running away. So let's say our entire fleet is trying to run, the Dictor might warp at range and drop a bubble so that our fleet all lands at 0, and then the Dictor can burn to the gate and jump, and the enemy fleet chasing gets stuck in the bubble. And dropping a bubble that is 70 kilometers or 50 kilometers, usually 70 kilometers, off of the gate is extremely useful, because if we imagine this is the gate, and I'll just burn out to 70 kilometers here, they're going to get stuck 90 kilometers off the gate, right? Because you drop the bubble at 70, and then the bubble has a radius of 20 kilometers. So they're going to be 90 kilometers off of their gate they want to get to. What are their options at that point? They can either burn in. Here we go. They can either burn in all 90 kilometers, right? They're going to be at the edge on this side, which will take time, a lot of time, depending on the size of their ships, and we can be attacking them or through the gate already, running away during that period. They can choose to burn off in a random direction 60 kilometers so that they're 150 from the gate and then warp to the gate. That's called pinging off, kind of. That's a variation of pinging off, which also takes time because they have to burn, instead of burning 90 kilometers in, they have to burn 60 kilometers off and then warp. Or they can ping off the celestial. So they might warp up to this planet here and then warp back to bypass the stop bubble. But they're very useful. They're very easy to set up because you're already have something to align to, or you just land at range and drop it. And you'll be doing this fairly often as Dictors. Not all the time, but on occasion, I guess. One other thing to note, though, is that this stop bubble is stopping me from warping here because it's within 500 kilometers of it. So if I drop a bubble instead at, let's say, greater than 500 kilometers, we'll have to wait for this one to go down too, then it's not going to work. So you can't put up bubbles that are, even if they're inline and active, you can't put them up in like the middle of a gate of a gate-to-gate solar system warp. They have to be within 500 kilometers of where the person's trying to land. So let's take a look here. How far away am I from this one at the moment? I am going to be greater than 500 in just a second here, but we still have to wait for this bubble to go down. But yeah, anywhere within 500 kilometers, as long as it's in line with where they're trying to land, they'll get stopped by it. Okay, we'll drop a bubble here. Oh, I can't warp because I'm in a bubble, naturally. But just to show you how that works. So this bookmark is 1,000 kilometers away from where I'm going to be warping from. And this bubble is going to be greater than 500, right? The bubble is 450 away. So I want to warp to here. This bubble is intersecting my path, but because it's more than 500 kilometers away from where I'm trying to land, it doesn't interfere with my warp at all, and I can just pass right through it. All right, so that's called stop bubbles. There's another variation, though, called drag bubbles. So where stop bubbles stop you from warping through, or warping through them to get to where you want to go, drag bubbles drag you past where you want to go. They're also sometimes called sling bubbles. The same rules apply, though. They have to be within 500 kilometers of where you're trying to land and in line with the warp vector, where you would go if you could. So here I am, 70 kilometers from this bookmark, and I'm going to drop a bubble. And now I'm going to warp back to my starting point here. And as you can imagine by the name drag bubble, and I might have just actually explained it, trying to warp to this bookmark here is now going to drag me into this bubble. Again, it's in line, right? Everything's in a straight line here. So if I try and warp here, my vector continues past it into this bubble. And because the distance between these is 70 kilometers, 50 kilometers to the edge, it's within 500, and if I warp here, I'm going to get dragged past it into the bubble, as we'll see now. Perfect. So drag bubbles have a couple uses compared to stop bubbles. One is that if you're camping a gate, so if we imagine this is our gate and all of our friends are here, then the drag bubble can have people end up closer to our fleet without our fleet having to burn through the bubble to get to them. It also can be convenient if you're camping a gate or trying to set up a drag bubble on a gate where other people might be warping to it. It's not as much of an inconvenience to burn to it or to ping off and then come back in. I guess those are the two main situations. Sometimes if you're on a keep star grid and you want to drag bubble, then it helps you keep out of the keep star's range. They basically have roughly the same usage case as a stop bubble though. They are generally though harder to set up. So if we were going to be setting up a stop bubble on our bookmark right here towards the ESS, then it's really easy to get everything lined up properly, right? All you have to do is be on whatever it is you're trying to protect. We'll pretend it's a gate again this time, or a wormhole or whatever. And to set up a stop bubble, all you have to do is align to the ESS, and you start burning away from where they're going to be landing, and then you can set up a bubble at 10 kilometers or 20 kilometers, all the way up to 500 kilometers, right? Super simple. For a drag bubble, though, we don't actually have anything in this direction that we can align to. And we can't do like keep at range ESS 3AU or something like that. It doesn't work that way. So what we have to do instead is manually pilot to get everything properly in line. So here we have our ESS, our ship, and the thing we want in between it. So if you click on what you're trying to stop bubble from, drag bubble from, so the ESS, then you get this line in space, right? So that way, even when you're facing away, you can kind of see where the line is. And then we're going to double click in space and turn on our MWD and start burning. And what we want is for the ESS, the bookmark that's representing our wormhole or gate or whatever, and our ship to all be in line with one another. And I got this pretty good right off the bat, but sometimes it'll be a little bit harder and you might be drifting off and then you'll have to correct a little bit. So I'll just throw myself off. So now we can see that I'm coming out of alignment over to the left a bit too much. So then I can correct by going over to the right a little bit. And I'm basically just trying to make sure everything is nicely in line. If you click on your ship, you get a nice circle as well that can help line things up. And you can also do C to track the ESS, right? Anyways, as long as everything is sufficiently in line, then you can drop a bubble. And now that we can see that definitely anyone who warps from the ESS to here is also going, their path is going to intersect our bubble, right? So what I've just done is set up a drag bubble for this bookmark from the ESS. And now anyone from the ESS who tries to warp to this drag bubble, assuming they aren't in a scepter or a ship with an interdiction nullifier running, is going to get sucked into my bubble. So that's one of the things we practice in the hands-on class, is just sort of that manually piloting to set up drag bubbles. Drag bubbles come up even less than stop bubbles, which already don't come up too often, although you definitely do want to know how to do it. But yeah, and then if this distance was greater than 500 kilometers, it would not work as well. And that's basically all we have for bubble mechanics. However, let's go over to the ESS now, actually, and take a look at how the mechanics change a little bit over there. Actually, one more quick thing before we head to the ESS. If a bubble brings your warp below 150 kilometers, then it'll prevent you from warping. So this bookmark is 160 away. It would usually be a valid warp to, but there's a bubble in between, so it's going to try and stop us here at 40 kilometer warp distance. So if we try and warp here, we can't because there's a warp disrupt probe intersecting our path. So we're trying to warp 160. It's calculating it as we're trying to only warp 40, 60 to the edge, 40. So we can't go. Oh no. All right, to the ESS. All right, so here I am in warp to the ESS, which is also a dead space grid. A dead space grid means you can't warp to other things on it. For example, if I try and warp up to this bookmark, it's going to tell me that natural phenomena is stopping me, even though the bookmark is a valid distance away. Same if I was trying to warp to a fleet member, you just can't warp anywhere on grid, right? Furthermore, anyone who warps to the ESS, even if it's something else that's on the ESS grid and not the beacon itself, will end up landing on the beacon or off it at the distance they warped to. This is good for dictors because it means that we know that wherever they're warping from, their path is going to intersect the beacon, and if we bubble it, their path is going to intercept our bubble. Now, bubbles on the ESS act very strangely. If you aren't bubbling the beacon at 0, but are bubbling like a stop bubble, if their path intersects the bubble, they'll still end up on the beacon at 0, or whatever. Yeah, they'll still end up at the beacon at 0. And if they're warping to bookmarks on the ESS, then even if the beacon's bubbled, they'll land off the beacon if they warp to the bookmark at range. Don't worry too much about that, though. The main thing we're focused on is bubbling the beacon at 0. So the advantage of this is that when people warp to the ESS, beacon at least, they'll be sucked into our bubble. And unlike previous bubbling we saw, where they end up at the edge of the bubble, they actually get sucked to the beacon at 0, right? So if we bubble the beacon at 0, and they end up at the beacon at 0, they're going to be right smack dab in the middle of our bubble, which is 20 kilometers burning out to be able to do anything. Furthermore, anyone who is inside a bubble can't take the acceleration gate. Not really applicable to us since we're in a destroyer, but extremely useful for stopping people from being able to get inside. So just as an example here, I'm going to warp to the beacon at 100. Notice if I warp to this bookmark at 100, it would be different, but again, too complicated for Dictor 101. So I'm warping to the beacon at 100, imagining that I want to set up at 100, or I want my fleet to be able to slide inside, and instead I am stuck inside a bubble. I have to burn 20 kilometers, probably with an afterburner, to get out to be able to take the gate or warp off. That's almost it for ESSs, and we do use them a lot because our fleet could be set up at 100, the enemy fleet warps to 0, and we're at optimals and they're in a bubble. Or if we wanted to brawl them down, we could set up a bubble and be set up at 0. They try and warp at 100 and they get sucked in and we end up brawling. However, as a Dictor pilot, one of the considerations, and we talk about this a lot more in the Big Brain Bubbled class, is how to stay alive, knowing your exits, right? So on this grid, if I am sitting here on the beacon at 0, which is where I always want to bubble pretty much, so that they have the 20 kilometers in every direction, I can't cloak because I'm on a dead space grid. So if I try and hit my cloak here, I'm unable to because, not because I'm within 200 of the beacon or the probe or the gate. I just can't bubble here because, I can't cloak here because I'm within like this, one of these circles, right? I'm still on the dead space too close. I can cloak if I burn like 100 kilometers off or 80 kilometers off or something. But if I have this beacon bubbled, and there's an enemy fleet warping in, I'm in a very dangerous position, right? I'm in a hazardous position because I can't cloak to escape. I can't slide in because I'm in a destroyer and because I'm in a bubble. And I can't warp off because I'm in a bubble. So the only option I have really is to burn out of this bubble and try and warp off if I want to escape. Therefore, sometimes it'll be useful to actually just sit here at 0, keep on spamming D-scan, looking for the enemy fleet to come in, And then if you see them in warp or you see them on short, then you drop one more bubble and then overheat your prop and burn out. That can be one way of trying to stay safe while keeping the beacon bubbled. Another option, though, is to keep the beacon bubbled by doing what I call drive-by bubbling of the beacon. Drive-by beacon bubbling. It's got a good alliteration sound to it. So in this case, what I do is I sit just outside of my bubble where I'm safe, right? So from here, if I want to, I can warp off. I'm outside of my bubble. And if something lands that I want to go in and scram, then I can easily burn in and scram them before they can do anything, right? Also, I have a heads up by watching short D-scan. And then to keep it bubbled while keeping myself as safe as possible, when my bubble's about to go down, you can have your system clock show seconds so that you can see the 2 minutes on the bubble. I turn my MWD on and I burn straight through. And then as I pass the beacon, I drop a bubble, right? And this refreshes it. I keep on burning. And then I can control space, glide to a stop outside my bubble. And now I'm ready to warp off again. And it's remained bubbled. And to save on bubbles, you can keep track of your bubbles so you only burn in right before it's about to go down. And this is another way of keeping an ESS bubbled while minimizing the risks to yourself. Now, again, this is more big brain bubble territory, but one way to think of it is if the FC asks for Dictor to keep the beacon bubbled, you can almost think of yourself as like an independent contractor, right? So they might say, oh, you can just sit at 0 and keep bubbling. And I mean, you can just listen to them if you want, but you can also speak up and say, oh, it's okay, I'll keep it bubbled by doing these drive-by bubbles. And you're sort of like, they're making the requests to keep it bubbled, and you're, as the expert, saying how you're going to keep it bubbled or deciding how you're going to keep it bubbled. Just something to keep in mind there. Okay, the next mechanic we're going to talk about is what it actually means to warp to something. You've probably warped to things a lot, but you might not have thought too much before about the actual steps that go into it. So if you look at the fitting of a ship, you'll see over here, if we simulate, that we have our align time, right? The time to enter warp from a full stop. So if we turn our prop mod off, this is the fit I'm using is over on CPU because I have this offline. You can see that I have a 2.98 second align time. So that means it'll take me 3 server ticks, 3 seconds to get into warp. And then at the end of the 3rd server tick, or however you want to call it, on the 3rd server tick, I'll enter warp. This requires a couple different steps though, right? So before I actually enter warp, my ship has to get up to speed and get pointed in the right direction. So if you're already aligned to an object, let's say I'm just aligned to the sun here, then my speed is already up and I'm already pointing towards where I'm trying to go. So if I'm aligned, fully aligned, and then I click warp, I will immediately enter warp. So there isn't a 3-second align time from being aligned towards the object. I'm like ready to go, right? If I click warp now, I guess I can show you, and then try and control space, it's not going to happen. So I'm now in warp, I control space, but I'm already off, right? So I tried to stop my ship, but I was already in warp and couldn't stop anymore. Usually though, if you're trying to enter warp from a full stop, then you actually do have time to do it. Control space, that is. And that's because your ship is busy turning and getting up to speed. So here, if I click on, let's say I'm going to warp, I guess I can warp back to the ESS. So I click warp, and you'll watch my speed start increasing, and my ship changes direction to start pointing towards it. And I'm going to press control space and interrupt my warp. But I'm not actually interrupting my warp, I'm interrupting my align to enter warp. Basically, when you click the warp to button, your ship does 2 things. It aligns and then enters warp. So I'll click warp, my ship starts turning, picking up speed. Oh, I didn't hit control space in time, so I'm already off. The Eris aligns very quickly. So it wasn't a very good example there. Let's try it again. This time, I will be burning in a random direction with my prop mod on. So now my align time, according to my fitting here, is with my prop mod on, under 5 seconds, right? So I'll warp on the 5th tick. So now if I try and warp to the sun, you'll see my ship starts turning, and it has to turn gradually, and then I can control space, and I come to a stop. So that's because I wasn't in warp yet. I was still aligning to get into warp as part of the process of clicking the warp button. All right? We'll talk about why that's really, really important in just a second when we're playing around on gates. It's also important, though, to note that when you're calculating your warp, or when the server is calculating your warp, the moment you enter warp, the server has already calculated where you're going to land as well. Okay? So when you enter warp, anything that changes after that about bubbles in your landing position is now moot. It's already decided where you're going to warp to, where you're going to land, and if somebody pops a bubble up while you're in warp, it's not going to make any difference. Same thing if a bubble goes down while you're in warp, but it was up when you started your warp, when you initiated your warp, when you entered warp, then you're still going to land where the bubble caused you to get dragged out of warp. So we can see that in action here. I'm going to throw up a bubble. On this bookmark right here. So this is Sol 500 Sun. Okay, so the bubble's going up. And then I'm going to warp off to something nice and... Actually, let's do something far away. Let's warp to the Fortizar. And then I'm going to try and come back and warp to this bookmark, Sol 500 Sun, at 0. And we'll see what happens when I land there. Since we have 2 minutes to wait for this bubble to go down for this experiment to work, I'll see you in a sec. All right, so here I am on the Fortizar, and you can see from D-scan that my bubble is still up, but it's just about to go down. I'm doing a 5-degree D-scan of the sun here. And we're going to be warping to our Sol 500 one. And we'll try and warp at 0 and land on it directly at 0. However, I've timed this so that I'm going to enter warp with the bubble still up, and we'll be landing once it's gone down. So I'll start warp now. I'm in warp. You'll notice on D-scan now there is no bubble. I warped to my bookmark at 0, so I should be landing at 0. There's no bubble up to stop me, but I don't land at 0. I land 20 off, right? So that's because the bubble was up when my position where I was going to land was calculated, which was done when I initiated warp. All right? And that's why sometimes if you're just gating around nullsec, sometimes you'll think you warped to a gate at 0, you end up at 20, you wonder what's going on. It's because there used to be a bubble there when you initiated warp. And the same thing is true for if the bubble goes up when you're in warp, right? So if you're already in warp to the ESS at 100, and then somebody bubbles the beacon at 0, that bubble does not affect where you're going to land. You are going to be landing where it was calculated before the bubble went up when you entered warp. So a very common trick is to have the entire fleet aligned to the ESS. The FC will say, Dictor, warp to the ESS at 0 and wait for my command. Dictor warps to the ESS, sits on it at 0. Then the FC will initiate warp for the fleet to 100 kilometers. And once the fleet's in warp, the FC will say, Dictor, bubble up and burn out of the bubble. And then what happens is the enemy fleet sees us warp to the ESS. So they chase us to the ESS, but we've entered warp before the bubble was up, and they've entered warp after the bubble was up. So we land at 100, they get sucked into 0, and then we can shoot them from 100, assuming that's our optimal range. All right? So that's one of the aspects of knowing how warping works. There's another one that's going to talk about it again when we're talking about gates, which is up next. All right, so I'm going to warp over to this gate at 0, and I want you to pay close attention to the distance I am from the gate. All right, when I land. This doesn't have anything to do with bubbles yet, just the mechanics of warping to objects and gates in general. All right, so even though I warped to the gate at 0, I landed 2,000 off of it, right? So that is just part of the random variation about how close you land to where you're actually trying to warp to. If you warp to a bookmark at 0, you don't land right on it at 0, you land, you know, within a couple kilometers of it. The other thing is, clearly, even though it says I'm 2,245 away from this gate, if you just look at my tactical overlay, I'm clearly, like, I'm 6 kilometers away from the actual center of the gate, right? And if I'm orbiting this gate at 500, like, I'm not 500 kilometers away from the center of the gate again. So this is because the gate actually has a model size in space, right? So if this is just a system gate, so it's a pretty small model, and it has a radius of about 7 kilometers or so, depending on exactly where you are around it. Different types of gates, like ANSYs, have almost 20 kilometer radius models. Same with regional gates. Constellation gates are a little bit bigger. But the point is that if you are at 0 on a gate, so let's approach this guy and just get as close as we can to it. It says we're at 0 right now, but I mean, we're not, right? If that's the center of the gate. We're off to the side a little bit. We're at 0 on the model, but we're not at 0 on the gate. Okay, so keep that in mind first. Second thing we have to keep in mind is that our bubbles have a 20 kilometer radius with the type of bubbles we're using. And then the last thing I want you to keep in mind is when I jump this gate, let's see how far away on the other side I spawn from it. So here I am 13 kilometers away from the gate. But that's 13 kilometers away from the model, which we just saw was about, what, 6 kilometers away from the center of the model. So that's 19 kilometers away from the center of the model. And that's basically true for all ships. There's a little bit of variation, but you're going to be spawning, for at least the system size gates, about 19 kilometers away from the middle. And my bubble has a range of 20 kilometers. So if I, as a dictor pilot, want to bubble this gate so that whoever comes through gets stuck in my bubble and can't warp off, and I'm at quote unquote 0 on the gate, which is actually 5 or 6 kilometers away from the center of the gate, and I drop the bubble now, then in this direction, on the side of the gate I'm on, my bubble will definitely cover 20 kilometers, and the person who is only 13 kilometers away will be inside my bubble. But on the far side of the gate, 20 kilometers minus these 6 kilometers minus another 6 kilometers is now down to 12 kilometers, and then people can spawn outside of my bubble. So the point I'm getting at here is that when you're bubbling a gate, you want to try and bubble it at 0 inside the model, at least for system gates like this. It's a little bit different for ANSYs and regionals and stuff like that, where you have to bubble, you have to use multiple bubbles and try and like surround the gate. So if I was trying to bubble this gate, what I would do is approach it with my prop mod on, and then just one pulse of prop mod's fine. And then once I get close enough, I control space and I try and glide to a stop right up almost inside the model, right? So that was pretty good. I bumped a little bit, but I'm definitely closer than if I was just approaching it. Like if I clicked approach right now, my ship doesn't move towards it, it moves away from it because I'm actually inside the model's range a little bit. When you see a friendly fleet land on a gate, you'll often see the dictors manually pilot, double click in space to come over, or use Q clicking to come over and sit right on top of the gate like this, or on the bottom. And the reason they're doing that is so that now if something jumps in, a bubble is going to be centered as close as possible to the center of the gate, and it's going to catch everybody, right? So anybody who spawns, you saw me spawn 13 kilometers away from the edge of the model, but if we add 5 or 6 kilometers onto that, I'm spawning 18 kilometers away from approximately where I am now, which is within the 20 kilometers of my bubble. So whenever you're bubbling a gate, you always want to be trying to do it not at 0 on the gate, but like at 0, 0, proper 0, getting almost inside the model. The only reason you don't actually like pilot inside of this which you can do if you want it to be like super guaranteed to get in there, is you start bumping off of things, right? And then if I tried to warp away, I might bump and I might get stuck. So you don't actually usually want to go inside the model, but just sort of sitting as close as you can to it while still being able to warp is ideal. All right. Another aspect about dictors that's probably one of the most important is that bubbling does not give you an aggression timer. So that means sitting here in a dictor, I am practically perfectly safe, right? If an enemy fleet jumped into me right now, I would not be worried in the slightest, because once they start decloaking, I can bubble them. And if they start locking me up and trying to attack me, I have lots of tank with 2 plates in my Eris or 2 medium shield extenders in your Saber. You can start orbiting the gate after you've bubbled if you'd like to reduce some incoming damage, hoping that they aggress on you so that they can't jump gate. And then once you are no longer comfortable, you can just jump gate and leave them all behind. Likewise, if I jumped into an enemy fleet, so let's say there was an enemy fleet on this gate, I'm still fairly safe. If they have really good pilots and insta-lockers and decloakers, then it can be trouble. But even in a really bad situation here, where the gate's bubbled so I can't warp off, there's a lot of enemies on grid, you can kill me pretty easily, I have my cloak, right? So what I can do is approach the gate, hit my cloak, and then hit my MWD. You can still turn your MWD on the same tick or 1 tick later than your cloak. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to just say I'm in trouble, I need to get out. I'm going to use hotkeys for this. So I have my hotkey set up for my low slots here. But if I click on jump and then cloak and then MWD. So now I'm MWDing towards the gate. I'm under cloak so they can't lock me up. People are probably burning towards me right now to decloak me, right? But I'm already within 7. Let's say they decloak me, I hit my MWD again. Now I'm burning in, they might scram me, they're doing damage, but I still get back to the gate in time to jump back to safety. You can, of course, also use your MWD to try and get out of a bubble, or use the MWD cloak trick to try and insta-warp off instead of crashing gate. Part of that depends on what sort of cloak you have fit. In the Eris, you can fit an improved cloak. In the Saber, you'll usually have a prototype cloak, which slows you down a little bit more and gives you more of a lock time. But using your cloak in these sort of situations is super handy for survivability on gates, and you'll see dictors just like crashing back and forth, bubbling. You can also bubble at the very end right before you jump to get another bubble at 0, or bubble before you cloak if you like to live dangerously. In that case, I would bubble MWD cloak rather than cloak MWD. But yeah, that's the reason you have a cloak on a dictor pretty much. All right, the last thing I want to talk about here, not the last thing, but the last thing to do with gates, and then we'll look at some footage of this actually happening, is back to when we were talking about how warps work, right? So you recall that I interrupted my warp after clicking warp because I was still in the align phase of warping by pressing control space, right, to stop my ship. Bubbles do the exact same thing. So whenever anyone is jumping into you and is holding gate cloak, you don't want to bubble right away. If it's an insta-aligning ship, such as a pod or a Hekate or most jackdaws, then you do need to bubble before they decloak. But for every other ship, essentially, anything that doesn't have an under 2-second align time, you can wait until you see them on your overview before clicking bubble. And then even if, when you see them on your overview, it's because they click to warp, your bubble will still interrupt their warp the same way that control space does. And they'll come to a screeching halt and be confused. Now, there's a lot of reasons this is important. One is because it confuses them, and they come to a stop, and they don't really know what happened, and those extra seconds while they sort of get their senses reorientated are invaluable. It also means that they aren't immediately trying to crash gate or burn out. They're trying to warp and then coming to a stop, so you gain seconds there. It also gives your own fleet more time to do stuff, right? So if your fleet is in warp to this gate and somebody is cloaked, then you want to wait to bubble until as many people as possible have had a chance, friendlies, to warp to the range they want to. Yeah, so you definitely want to use delayed bubbles whenever you can. So let's actually take a look at that in action now. All right, so here's some footage of me flying an Eris. And we're currently chasing Caracals and Standing Fleet, and I know that they are coming through this gate, so you can see them flashing in here, right? These are Caracals jumping into me, and I'm an Interdictor, hyperspatial, so I got here just in time. My fleet is jumping as well and going to warp here to help out, and you can see that they are spiking into system. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I want to not bubble right away, because I know they're Caracals, they're not going to warp in under 2 seconds. So I want to try and get as close to the center of the gate as possible, right? I warp to it at 0, but I'm still a kilometer off, and I want to be as close as possible. So I start by approaching, but that's not exactly proper, and then I double-click inside. So now I'm coming up to 0 on the gate, right? So I haven't quite gotten to where I want to be, but the Caracals and other things have decloaked, so there's no more time, and I need to bubble now. And I want you to carefully watch their velocities over on the right. They all decloaked at the exact same time, so that means that they took a fleet warp or a regroup. And they're all currently picking up speed as they're attempting to align as part of getting into warp. And then I'm going to bubble them. There goes my bubble, and you'll notice their speeds now are dropping back down and coming down to 0. Right? And they're confused, they don't know what they're doing. Their speeds are dropping, they tried to warp off, they're not now aligning anywhere or starting to fight, and that's sort of where you can get that delayed bubble to catch them. And you'll also notice, over up in the top left, I do not have an aggression timer, so even if these guys were all about to come and attack me and my fleet wasn't landing, I would still be completely safe, right? I'd be able to jump gate and get out if I wanted to. So that sort of idea of not bubbling right away, getting into position as much as you can on the center of the gate, and then waiting for them to decloak before bubbling, called a delayed bubble, is really important for dictoring. Conversely, you can see here that although I'm on grid with a whole bunch of Caracals, and a whole bunch of them are within 20 kilometers, they are currently, as you can see from their velocity vectors, already aligned out and ready to warp. So bubbling at this point is too late. Even though the bubble is going to go up in time, they're going to be able to enter warp. You can see some of them already have. And it's going to mean they can get away despite the fact that they kind of appear in a bubble. So if you watch here, let's see if we can just go ahead. So there's the bubble. The overview seems to show them still in range, but they're already entering warp, and so they're all going to escape here. So this sort of realizing, watching their align, watching their speed, and figuring out if you're still in time to bubble or not is another important, and it's kind of seat of your pants dictoring skill. So a lot of times you'll hear the FC, as they're fleet warping people on top of the enemy fleet, they'll say, Dictors bubble on land, bubble, 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 and be like freaking out about wanting a bubble. And you'll be spamming bubble, trying to bubble what the FC wants. But when you finally land and the bubble actually goes off and it looks like you're going to get them and they all warp out, and then there's sort of like that 1 second delay between your client and the server, and then the FC will say, wait, no bubbles, because their fleet's gotten off, and now you're only bubbling your own fleet. The bubble still has already been submitted, and it pops. And bubbles your own fleet, allowing the other fleet to get away. So one of those really comes down to experience, knowing if you can get them or not, and even the FCs can't really tell necessarily. Sometimes you hold back when they say bubble because you know they're about to escape. But in general, listen to the FC, unless you really, really, really know exactly what you're doing and know what the FC wants, even if they haven't said it. All right, here's some other footage along the same line. This time I'm in standing again, chasing down a Vedmak. In the Big Brain Bubble class, we talk a lot more about when to bubble or not in these sort of situations, because it cuts off your own fleet, but it can sometimes stop the enemy from getting away. It's a very nuanced decision. But you can see here that I am landing with the Vedmak and going to be jumping with him. And once on the other side, we don't want to bubble right away again because the Vedmak is not going to insta-warp. So instead we approach the gate and try and get it to as close as we can to 0. We're ready to bubble in case he despawns within 20 kilometers of us. But he's currently holding cloak still. Then we coast to a stop right at 0 on the gate. And now we have him, right? The second that he decloaks, we can now bubble him, and he'll be within 20 kilometers. If we go back just a touch here, to this point here, let's say, where I'm approaching the gate, or right after I jump, a lot of people would be tempted to bubble right now. But there's no point in doing that, because the Vedmak's not here, and if we bubble, we're only catching one side of the gate. He could easily spawn above, below, to the other side, and then be able to warp off, and we might catch other people, and we are guaranteed to catch ourselves. So instead, we just hold off for a sec. We're ready to bubble if he despawns within 20 kilometers of us. Otherwise, we want to hold off on bubbling and try and MWD to the gate, control space so we don't bounce off it, and that we drift into it at 0 rather than stopping at the edge of the model and get as close as we can in. So as you can see, ready to bubble, he's not despawning, or he's not decloaking, control space so that we don't stop at the edge of the model but actually drift into it a little bit, and then we got him. So yeah, this is the sort of stuff you'd be doing when playing gate games in Interdictor. One other thing that I should add here too, which is a bit beyond the scope of this class, but covered in big brain bubbles, is what to do after the Vedmak decloaks and you bubble it. You don't want to immediately approach and go in for scram. There's other ships, all of those frigates you can see on grid, that are going to be better at that than Interdictor is. If the Vedmak starts burning out, then by all means you can go out and scram him and help apply your DPS. But your main priority is if he starts crashing gate. Then you have to jump through, because you're the one without aggression, even though you drop the bubble, it doesn't give aggression. Reapproach and get to 0, 0, 0 on the other side. And be ready in case he makes it back to gate to bubble him on the other side. Just something to keep in mind. Funnily enough, well, we've talked a lot about bubble mechanics and how they work in different situations, different types of bubbles, and a little bit about gates as well, which, to be fair, is a large part of Dictoring, playing around on gates. We haven't actually talked about sort of the quintessential Dictor role of bubbling enemy fleets during actual fleet combats. For this, we're going to need to talk about manually piloting some more. We've done it already. Oh, I'm cloaked up here. We've done it already when we talked about getting close to the gates, right? So one way you can manually pilot is just by double-clicking in space. So you double-click in space, and you start moving in the direction you double-clicked in. So this is how I prefer to manually pilot. It's kind of like the old school way of doing it in a sense. But I prefer it because, I don't know, I just prefer it. People have different ways of doing it. The other option is something called Q clicking, which I will sometimes use. If you hold down Q, which is your approach button, you sort of get this vector that you can place. And then you can also, after clicking once, change your height above the celestial of the universe, apparently, or at least the galaxy. Everything seems to be on the same plane, doesn't it? And then you can set where you want yourself to go. So this is another method of manually piloting. I find, as I said, I like double-clicking in space more, especially when you're doing one-on-one fights or tackling or dictoring. I just like it more. The advantage of Q-clicking is that you can stay zoomed out, and if you're just trying to orbit something on a plane, then you can kind of, let me turn my prop mod on here. So I pick up a little speed. Then you can kind of keep an orbit in this way. So right now I'm double clicking rather than clicking to change my altitude, if you will. Attitude, I guess, in space. Well, that's the positioning of your spacecraft, not attitude. Anyways, but if you were trying to orbit, let's say I was trying to orbit this bookmark, then I could keep a nice high view, right? and then keep my orbit going that way. And of course, if this was an actual ship, I could see that I'm 26 kilometers, and then I could try and stay by Q-clicking. So by double-clicking instead of single-clicking, changing my height, I'm just setting the height at the same time. So this is handy for like orbiting in a plane. All right, so that's, and then also if you Q-click, once you get to the spot that you Q-click to, you're approaching that position, so you stop there. Whereas double-clicking, you just head off to infinity, right? Okay, so those are the two types of manual piloting, and they're very important when it comes to dictoring, sceptering, flying, tackle of any sort. If you're the Logi anchor or the FC and you're piloting the fleet around, if you're doing EWAR and you want to pull range from things, then you want to double click. You basically want to get into manual piloting as soon as you can. But when we're manually piloting to bubble the enemy fleet, one of the reasons we need to do it, instead of just clicking approach on a target, like if this was the enemy FC, is that we don't generally want to bubble the entire enemy fleet, or at least you do once, but more importantly, what you want to do is place bubbles in front of the enemy fleet. So you need to sort of set yourself at an angle so that you end up about 20 kilometers in front of the enemy FC, who they're anchoring up on. So that way their entire fleet will burn into your bubble, and then has to burn 40 kilometers if they continue in the direction they're going to get out of your bubble. And that's kind of how you keep the enemy fleet bubbled. Sometimes you'll go in for scram on the anchor, depending on how valuable you are to the fleet. Like if you're the only dictor, then you definitely might want to hold off on that and try and keep safe and keep your range, because it's important you stay alive. If there's 20 dictors and like 300 hacks on grid, then you might want to go in for a scram if there's nobody else scramming them to slow them down, because you're more disposable. So let's take a look at some of that in action as well now. All right, so here I am, just landed on an ANT-C with a big fight already going. This was during the war, during the August of 2022. And my fleet is about to warp to the Antiplex as well, and I'm looking to bubble the enemy fleet so that our fleet can kill them. Pretty straightforward, right? So I'm looking at where the enemy is moving around, and I start picking up on the fact that they're heading in this direction, so I start burning that way. And then you can see that they are anchoring up on this dude over here, right? I noticed that as well, and first I approach him just for a second as a temporary stopgap, but now I'm double-clicking in front of him. So I want to try and drop a bubble in front of their fleet, rather than just like burning directly at him and bubbling over here on top of them. And then once I get within range, I talk a little bit about why this is a little bit subpar in the big brain bubbling one, but I'm about 20 kilometers away from him now. So I approach him, drop my bubble. It's a little bit late. And then I go in for the scram as well, because I noticed that he was the anchor before anybody else, so I'm the only one in position to scram him. So then I scram them, and you can see their entire fleet is now burning into my bubble. They still have to burn another 20 kilometers to get out of it, and their anchor is now scrammed, so the entire fleet here is served up for our fleet to come in and kill. Now, because this was such a huge fight, I wasn't worried at all about dying. I mean, it's just going to be a quick brawl, and I want to make sure that they can't escape. So this was more of a suicide scram type situation. But now they're all bubbled, they're all scrammed, and our fleet's flowing in to deal with them. Yeah, so that's what it can look like if you just get one bubble and a quick scram off. I'll show you something that involves flying in front of the fleet a little bit longer though now. All right, so in this fight, you can see that we're fighting a Cyclone Fleet Issue fleet, and they're anchoring up on this guy here, or at least burning in this direction. You can see there's already a long chain of bubbles as they've burned away, and we've been trying to keep them bubbled. And I'm hanging about 40 kilometers ahead of their anchor. I'm being yellow boxed by some people, but I'm not too worried about it. I mean, pretty fast. I have my MWD SIG reduction bonus. I don't have too big of a cloak. Too big of a SIG because I'm armor tanked. And yeah, so let's just watch what I do. So as they're burning out, I'm getting ready to come back in a little bit and bubble them again. See, some of them are getting out, but their main fleet's still in it. Somebody else bubbles, which is nice. Just sort of trapping them for a couple seconds longer as they're burning. And then I'm just manually piloting, trying to position myself. That extra bubble gave me a little bit more time. We want to save our bubbles as much as possible because you only get 3 before a minute reload. And then you can see right here, like this is the idea, right? Just as their anchor is leaving the bubbles, they start entering a new bubble. And if they keep burning in the same direction, they're gonna have to burn 40 kilometers through my entire bubble. And if they start turning, then their fleet's gonna get sucked into my bubble. And I'm just sort of manually piloting, trying to stay ahead of them, right? And then this continues on a little bit longer. I only have 1 left in the tube now. That's what they call it when how many bubbles you have in the tube. That one was nice, filling in the gaps. So I'm still trying to stay ahead of them, stay out of range, stay in front of them. I see they're going down a bit, so I start correcting as well, taking some damage, ready to bubble again. And then I think on comms here, they said to bail out, and we were going to come back in a second. So I'm hitting my rep, I get webbed into warp, and I'm off. Safe and sound. And here you can see how this fight went, right? So we started from the gate, and we just went all the way along, down this long chain, bubbling as we go to make sure that they can't warp off. So this is one of the things that dictors are doing during a fight. And then after my bubbles ran out, I might want to warp off to a ping and warp back in. I might want to cloak up on grid if I feel like I can't get out. I might just want to overheat my prop and then stay at like 100 kilometers while reloading and then cycle back in when I'm almost done reloading. All sorts of different options there, trying to stay alive and keep them bubbled. In this case, they were afterburner fit, so there was no point of going in for a scram either. All right, we can see the same sort of getting in front of the fleet and bubbling in this clip, except this time I jumped into it. So rather than already being sort of like off on grid, all I'm doing is trying to align to where they're aligning. I'm overheating my prop and trying to get in front of them, right? So I am approaching one of them at the moment. I could just be approaching what they're aligning to. Overheat my prop because I want to try and hurry up and get out there. And then at this point here, if they warp off, it would be good to bubble. I want to try and hold off as long as possible to catch as many as possible. It's just sort of like a gut instinct. So I bubble most of them there. I'm still burning out in front. I want to try and hold off until this bubble connects with my last bubble. So I left it a little bit late, potentially, and these bubbles aren't fully connected, so people in the middle can warp. And then right here, I'm getting attacked by all sorts of them, but I just managed to warp out in time. I should have probably aligned before warping there. Oh, actually, I was armor tank, so I still had a ton of tank. But you saw that, just like jump in, bubble them, get safe. All right, and this is just a few moments later. I'm almost done reloading my bubbles. I'm repairing up my heat as much as I can, and I'm warping in to a ping on grid. So again, I can see where they are. I find another thing I can ping off of that's closer to them. So I warp up there as well. Nice thing about the Ares is it has that quick align. And now I'm trying again to just get over there and bubble them. I'm aligning to something in advance so that after I bubble, I can just warp right off if they try and alpha me. And then same deal, I'm trying to bubble in front of them so that if they continue anchoring up, then they're going to end up in my bubble. And once again, I'm almost too far away in advance here, where I'm catching the front end of them, and if they do keep burning, but the fight's kind of over there, so it might be nicer to bubble there. But yeah, that's the general idea. Okay, and right there, actually, I almost got killed because of a mistake I made. So I don't know if you noticed. Let me just back it up a touch here. Okay, so at this point here, what I'm trying to do is come back around and then circle back in so that I can bubble like behind my own bubble because I bubbled so far ahead. And I can also see I'm getting yellow boxed by a fair amount of people here. So I'm going to be taking some rapid light missile. Oh wait, what are these? Drake Navies? Well, I'm not sure what type of damage I'm going to be taking. But I'm going to be taking some damage too, so I want to try and get safe. So I'm planning on sort of like curving around here. But then I realized that the damage coming in is pretty high. I'm already in half my tank, right? Even though I have this Ansel here, it's basically buffer tank. So now what I'm thinking is, okay, I got to get out. And I can't bubble again, because if I bubble again, I'm bubbling myself and I'm going to die. So since I'm already turning in this direction, I look for something over here to warp to, right? So I'm out of my bubble. I want to try and stay on grid so I can keep eyes there. So I'm going to try and warp over to that before anybody can kill me. However, right before I click warp, which is where I'm basically aligning to, so it would be a pretty quick align to get to warp there, I get fleet warped by the FC. And this is very, very dangerous for Dictors to have fleet warp on. Same with Scepters, because often you're doing your own thing, you're aligned to your own Celestial to get safe, and all of a sudden you get a fleet warp and you start aligning towards wherever the FC's fleet warping everybody. So I might have turned back into my bubble. I definitely did turn back into the enemy. I'm no longer got my velocity vector mostly correct. I'm now just warping in a random direction with my MWD on. So this is terrible. Like, I'm looking at how slowly I'm turning back in, can't get into warp, and fortunately I do just manage to make it into warp without going back into my own bubble or anything. So I got lucky there. But in general, you want to have fleet warp exempt when you're in a Dictor, unless the FC is warping you and you want the warp, in which case you have to toggle it back on. So turning your fleet warp accept on and off is an important consideration. I won't say what's best. Sometimes you need it on if the FC has combat probes or is warping somewhere and you don't know where they're going. Other times you want it off, especially if you're fighting on grid, because you want to be able to get out safe. And if you're a hyperspatial Dictor, usually you want to land before the fleet. So even if the FC is warping like the fleet to a gate, and you just want to warp to the gate at 0 as well with the fleet, you still want to warp on your own so you get that hyperspatial warp speed rather than being slowed down by the slowest ship in the fleet. All right, and that's about all I have for you. If you enjoyed seeing that footage, including me messing up a couple times there, then you'll probably enjoy attending the Big Brain Bubble class, where I have much more in-depth discussion about all sorts of different engagements and when to bubble and when not to and why or why not. I mean, it's never like the perfect decision, right? There's always going to be trade-offs. Even the perfect bubble is going to cut off your own fleet in some way and get your own people killed some of the time at least. It's just if you're still want to do it or not, if you accept that as acceptable losses. But yeah, so come join that class if you have the opportunity to, or watch it if it's on Twitch or YouTube or whatever else in the future. The last thing I want to leave you with is about bubbling your own fleet, which basically you never want to do, right? There are times where it's the right call, in that, you know, your fleet's sitting on a gate at 0, something jumps in, it decloaks, and you can bubble it and catch it, and then your fleet can kill it. You just have to be damn sure that that's what the FC wants, right? Because that means that your fleet cannot warp off. So if you don't know, if you are not absolutely sure that's what the FC wants, then you do not do it. You can always ask, right? Would you like a bubble here? Do that instead, okay? Otherwise, you can get the entire fleet killed. There could be an enemy fleet who's sitting on the gate on the other side, and when you bubble to catch that one person who jumped in, that could just be a bait ship they sent in, hoping to get people to aggress and bubble, right? And then they're going to come in and kill us. So make sure you ask. Same thing if you're, what else? Hunting ratters, like if there's an Ishtar that a scout's tackled and your fleet warps in to kill it, you don't want to bubble without asking, because the light tackle might need to warp off if they're getting too much damage from the Ishtar's drones. And if you bubble, then you're trapping them there and they can't warp off anymore. If the Ishtar is already tackled and scrammed and webbed by other people, then you don't need a bubble, right? You might want to bubble for pod, which is where you wait until the ship blows up, and on the very tick that it dies, you hit your bubble, and then you can bubble their pod. But even then, you want to make sure you know what you're doing, because maybe you're in a site where the rats are going to kill you, and by bubbling, you're trapping your fleet there with the rat damage coming in. Or maybe the FC, immediately after killing this Ishtar, doesn't want to wait around to kill the pod. He wants to warp the fleet to a gate, because he knows that something else is coming through. And by bubbling, you're stopping your fleet again. So whenever your own fleet is going to be in the bubble, you just have to know what you're doing. And if you're in doubt at all, then ask. I mean, in some ways that even applies to not just bubbling your own fleet, but bubbling where your fleet wants to go, right? So if your fleet is chasing an enemy fleet, and the enemy fleet lands on a gate and you land with them, you don't necessarily want to bubble then, because after you bubble, they can just jump the gate and your fleet who's chasing will get stuck in the bubble and have to burn to the gate 20 kilometers. So even when you're chasing things down and the FC is saying, bubble them if you can, you still have to be aware that what they mean is bubble them if you can in a way that allows us to get there still somehow. And those sort of situations are dicey, and it comes with experience and thinking things through. And yeah, big brain bubbles, that's the sort of stuff we talk about. I guess I should mention, now that we're almost done, that there technically are two other types of bubbles in addition to the warp disrupt probes. So if we just take a quick look here. In addition to warp disrupt probes, which are the ones that we are using the vast majority amount of the time, these are the ones that last 2 minutes in space with a 20 kilometer radius of effect. We also have surgical warp disrupt probes, which are very niche. The only time you're really going to be using them, still can only fit 3 in the tube. The difference is that these guys only have a 10 kilometer radius, wherever it shows that. Oh, here we go, 10 kilometers. So that means they're completely useless trying to bubble a gate when something jumps in through it, because everything will spawn outside of it. However, their maximum flight time is 180 seconds, as opposed to 120, right? So 3 minutes in space. That means that extra minute means that these can be more useful if you're trying to bubble, set up a bunch of like stop bubbles and drag bubbles on a grid. So like if you're trying to keep a hostile ANSI bubbled from multiple gates, then you might use these guys just so you have that extra minute. And because you're not trying to stop them from warping off after they jump in, you're trying to catch them in drag and stop bubbles. And then the other type is the Wubble, so-called Wubble, the web disrupt bubble, I guess this might be what it's called officially. Let's see. Stasis webification probe, not quite. These guys have an area effect range of 15 kilometers. However, they aren't actually like a bubble. I mean, they affect a sphere, or I guess it's more accurately a ball, with a radius of 15 kilometers. But what happens is the second you click it, everything within 15 kilometers is webified for 30 seconds. So this does have some usage. Might be useful if you're in a fleet with paladins and you try and have them apply to a fleet that's trying to stay on grid already or is already bubbled. Like they're either staying to fight on their own volition, or they're already bubbled so they can't warp off. Then you might use Webifier bubble to slow them down and help the paladins apply. Also in some sort of gate camp situations, you might use Wubbles to help prevent people from crashing gate. Actually, in the footage you saw when we were fighting the Cyclone fleet issues that were afterburner fit, one of the dictors had Wubbles because it helps slow down all of the A-being ships without needing to get webs from like a Hugin or a Hyena. So those are the two other types of bubbles. Basically, if you look at this one here, I've been doing a lot of little example testing here, so it might not, how many do I have of what? Get out of here, Windows. So I currently have only 4 regular ones left. Usually I fly with around 40 in like a new fit. If I'm going out on a roam, I might bring more, like up to 60. And then I always usually bring 5 web bubbles, because that's how many you can fit in the tube. And if you don't bring web bubbles, it's a guarantee that the FC is going to ask for web bubbles, and you won't have them, and it'll be a letdown. And if you do bring them, then you're never going to need them. That's sort of the rule right there. But yeah, there's other types of bubbles. The only ones we're really interested in, though, at the moment, and that you're mostly only going to be using, are the standard warp disrupt probes. Something from this. Dictors are needed in every fleet, as I said, and we talked a lot about some more complicated situations there at the end. But for the most part, you just fly with the fleet and do what the FC says. Bubble when the FC says bubble. Bubble what the FC says bubble. When the FC says bubble, and that sort of stuff is pretty straightforward at first, although you'll die a lot and make some mistakes probably at first as well. But that's part of the fun. Dictors are always going to get SRP and home defense and strat ops, so even though the hulls and the fits can cost like 70 million or so, 80 million maybe, you're still getting like 15 million in insurance and then the rest of it in SRP. So it's no real loss there. So yeah, try it out. Get yelled at for bubbling. Get praise for bubbling. The latter is much more rare. But it's a lot of fun, and you're playing a critical part, and you're thinking, and you're definitely not just like F1 monkeying. You're holding your aggression so that you can jump gate and escape and just bubbling things. And then sometimes you'll get on a kill mail by somebody trying to warp out of your bubble, which is how you can get on kill mails with bubbles, the only way. Or you actually might scram something and apply some DPS in some situations. As I mentioned at the very beginning, if you do see a Dictor 101 class pinged, I'd still recommend you join it. You can ask any questions, clarifications, follow-ups, things I might have missed could crop up through the instructor or other people's awesome questions. And of course, you can also try all of this out, right? So in the actual class, you can try cloak crashing gate, delayed bubbles, manually piloting to get on top of the gate, manually piloting to get in front of somebody, to bubble in front of them, all that sort of practice, setting up drag bubbles, etc. I mean, you can also just try that out on your own in a quiet system where you're not going to interfere with anybody, but doing it in a fleet with somebody there who you can ask questions and other people as well is always a good idea. So I recommend doing that if you have the opportunity to still. All right. Well, that's it. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask in any of our many chat channels, Newbeans, Discord, in-game. I'm Sophia, as you can see. So feel free to say hi or ask any questions if you see me in fleets or in game or whatever as well. And get out there and get bubbling when it's opportune to do so.